My guest today is Rebekah Rotstein, and she is the creator of the medically endorsed Buff Bones system, providing bone health education and exercise to manage and prevent bone and joint issues for people of all ages. She's an industry leader in Pilates, bone health, and movement education. Rebekah was diagnosed with osteoporosis at the age of 28 and has been helping people improve their bone health ever since. I have wanted to talk about osteoporosis on the podcast forever, so I am absolutely delighted to finally be able to do that with an expert. Welcome, Rebekah.
Thanks for having me here, Rachel. I'm happy to talk with you.
I'm really excited that this has been such a gap on the podcast, and as we go into midlife, we need to know about how to look after our bones. So I want to start right at the beginning where you found out. So it must have been very shocking to have been diagnosed with osteoporosis at 28. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. It was devastating, and it put me into certainly spiraled me into a depression, and I don't think that's uncommon. In fact, I know it's not uncommon, having for the last 20 years spoken and worked with so many people who've had similar experiences. The thing that I think is a little different about mine is obviously I was very young. It's not unusual, but it's not as common. But secondly, it was a little bit different for me because I was an exercise professional. So I had a number of resources at my disposal that the average person might not have. And even with all of that, still as an advantage, essentially, it still was extremely difficult. The reason I found out, though, unlike many people who might find out because they've experienced a fracture, I was very fortunate. I've never had a fracture. The reason I even got a bone density test in the first place was because I was taking some additional coursework. I was a Pilates teacher trainer for others to become Pilates teachers, and I was taking some additional coursework and discovered that you build a majority of your bone density in your teenage years. So really that's the time that you're building up your peak bone mass as a reservoir, essentially, for the rest of your life. And some light bulbs went off when I was taking this course, because the statistics have differed anywhere from 85 to 90%. At the time, I think it was stated 98% of your bone density built at this point from childhood through teenage years. But I also was looking back at what my own history had been. Okay, what was going on at that point? Well, I was a ballet dancer. I had stopped menstruating, and menstruation at puberty is what starts building up your bone density as well, because of the estrogen increase. And as that was not happening for me, I realized, this has put me at greater risk. Not to mention, I have a lot of risk factors, just heredity, and also being very small boned as well. So I thought, let me just get a baseline for later in life. And then I was really shocked and pretty flattened to learn that, wait, you're being told right now that you have osteoporosis.
I know. I can't imagine, actually. I mean, I was given a diagnosis of early menopause, but that was 41. I can't imagine for you at 28. It must have been so shocking. So do you think the athleticism of being a ballet dancer, was that part of it, do you think, that led to that?
In a way, yes, in the sense merely that, because, you would think, we're told to exercise, right? That should be good for your body. Exercise is helpful to an extent, though. So in my situation, it's not that it was too much exercise. It's that there is a certain ratio metabolically of how much you're exercising that has to be met with how much you're eating. And this is very common with high performance athletes and dancers, that they stop menstruating because they're not eating enough. And it's not necessarily even anything to do with disordered eating. It's just you're not eating enough to match how much caloric expenditure you are partaking in. In other words, how much exercise you're doing. Well, if you're exercising a lot, you have to match that with your food intake. And so that's not what was happening. And this is something that certainly is discussed widely now, publicly, as well as in among the dance community and certainly among the athletic community. But we're talking 30 years ago and such, actually maybe more, none of this was talked about in that way. So now there's a name for this. It's known as low energy availability or relative energy deficiency in sport, specifically where osteoporosis can be a side effect of the lack of menstruation and this whole female athlete triad. But this is something that we didn't really know about in the public years ago. So I think there's great measures now to prevent other people from experiencing what I experienced. But to answer your question, yes, there was an element of my exercise or my dancing that related to this for sure.
And the pressure, I guess, on a young female dancer to be a certain shape, to be a certain size.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, really, when I had stopped menstruating, there was I really was very skinny. I had no idea. I think I weighed 82 pounds. I'm only 5 feet tall, so, keep that in mind. But also my body just had never really fully developed. So it wasn't a matter of me trying to restrict my eating. It was just, this is all I'd ever really known.
Yeah.
And nobody thought much otherwise because I'd never been bigger. I'd never looked differently. But yeah, absolutely within the dance world, I think this is changing now. But there has always been a huge emphasis on aesthetics.
How dangerous. It's really shocking sort of thinking about that, isn't it? And the pressure, I mean, the pressure in the moment that people are putting themselves under, but it's the future pressure, it's the implications of that activity that they're going to come and, bite them in the bum later on in life. It's
or bite you in the
that's
bones.
really hard. Yeah, bite you in the bones. Yeah.
But you know what? I think when this is part of also the message that we want to get out is, we're talking about midlife and how midlife is a time for prevention also of what will happen in the future. So many people aren't thinking about their bones right now. It tends to be an afterthought because bone loss is asymptomatic, right? You don't feel it. You don't know that you're losing bone mass.
Yes.
And we all do starting in our 30s, by the way. But really the message that we try to create at Buff Bones is, hey, at midlife, and I am a midlife woman now. So at this point, even if you're not thinking about it right now, your future self depends on what you do right now. Hip fractures that are the greatest concern for our healthcare system with osteoporosis don't happen typically at our age. It's in the elderly population. So it's us in, whether it's 15 to 30 years from now. But similarly, when you are a teenager, you're not thinking or caring what's going to happen about midlife. So part of this is this whole huge circle of life to be discussing and identifying, hey, you are going to care later in life what you're doing with your body right now as a teenager or in your 20s. Your future self really does matter.
So what does it actually mean to have osteoporosis? What can you tell us exactly what is it?
So osteoporosis is both loss of bone density or just low bone mass accompanied by structural changes to the bone, which make it more possible to fracture. Now, the diagnosis, interestingly, though, is usually solely based on the first part of that definition I gave you. So, a quantitative measurement based on your bone density scoring, because it is less common and less available to identify the structural changes. Also, though, something that most people don't realize is that regardless of what your bone density score tells you, if you've had a fragility fracture or a low trauma fracture, meaning from standing height, not in a car accident, not from falling off a ladder, but walking, tripping, you fracture your wrist, most common fracture, by the way, for midlife women, that automatically classifies you as osteoporosis as well. So I've had people come to me and say, oh, I don't have osteoporosis. I just, this is what my bone density was. And then in an intake, I hear about the wrist fracture they had. I'm like, well, guess what? Actually, technically, you do have osteoporosis.
Mm. I broke my wrist, but I did it in my 20s, and I was drunk at the time, and I fell backwards down some stairs. And I put my arm out and just smashed it. So that's obviously different,
That is
isn't
different.
it? That's very
Yes.
different. But goodness, that taught me a lesson not to do that. I was drunk because I hadn't eaten all day because I'd been so busy at work, and then I was organising an event for my other half at the time, and so I didn't drink that much, but it was all on an empty stomach, and then I just had this awful, fracture in my wrist. But never again.
No.
It taught me an important lesson. But I guess now, yes, if I was to fall at this age and do something similar, then that would mark me as having osteoporosis.
Well, hopefully you would never fall downstairs again.
Yes.
If you tripped and
If I tripped, yeah.
That would classify, yes.
Yeah. But also, I mean, just talking about falls is a bit of a sidetrack. I now know if I do fall, to put my arm, because I run, or I was running, and I would fall occasionally, trip over a root or something. And I've learnt to roll a little bit and to put my arms up so that I'm not putting my hands down, so that my hands are not taking the brunt, and therefore my wrists. Anyway, that's a bit of a sidetrack.
Well, that actually brings up a whole other interesting conversation about falls and the way to fall. And, I don't necessarily want to discourage people from placing their wrist out, because the reason you instinctively extend your wrist is to protect your head, right?
Yeah.
For me, I'd rather you fracture. Like I said, most midlife people are not going to fracture a hip, but at the same time, it's better to, if anything's going to fracture, I'd rather it be a wrist than a hip or pelvis. So,
Yes.
there is a protective reflex to that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Wow. I'm going to learn so much today. I just know it. So what are some of the common misconceptions about osteoporosis?
Where to begin? Well, for one thing, it is painless. So people sometimes mistake osteoporosis or confuse osteoporosis with osteoarthritis. They sound similar because they both have the word osteo, which means bone, at the beginning. But unlike osteoarthritis, which is painful and is specifically the degeneration of the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage that is at the end of the joints and is around the articulating surface of joints. Unlike that, osteoporosis is really the degeneration in some ways. I hate to use that word, but of the bone. So it's the deterioration essentially of the bone mass and the structural changes, microarchitecture essentially of the bone. But that's painless. You don't feel it. You don't know what's happening. And there is a relationship between the two, but they are two different quote unquote pathologies. So that is one thing just to clarify for people, because people are like, oh, I'm in so much pain. It's this osteoporosis. I'm like, no, the only reason that you'd have pain from osteoporosis is because of a fracture, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It's not related to the actual loss of bone mass. Other things, well, for one thing, people thinking that it's only happening to older people, right? And this has been something for 20 years now. I've been working on changing the public perception of that it's not an old person's disease like people often think. And I, again, use little quote marks for that. There are two forms of osteoporosis, or what we would call primary as well as secondary. Primary osteoporosis is the loss of bone mass and changes to the structure, essentially, that happen as a result of age, but especially sex hormone related. So we can lose up to 20% bone mass within the first 5 to 7 years after menopause. And that creates that loss, that rapid decline in estrogen also accelerates bone loss because estrogen preserves the bone mass in our younger years. It builds it in the teenage years, like I was saying, I didn't have, and then it preserves it. And then when you lose estrogen, you also lose bone mass. So that is related to, or that's what we refer to as primary osteoporosis. It's happening related to menopausal changes. Secondary osteoporosis can happen at any age, though. Secondary osteoporosis is this bone loss that's occurring because of medications that you take or medical conditions that you have. Say you have celiac disease, right? You might be experiencing this you could be 35 or 30 and you're identifying that this absorption issue you had for years. Celiac disease, you get a bone density test and hey, look, your bone density is already quite low. It could be from rheumatoid arthritis. It could be related to hyperparathyroidism. Could be related to chemo or radiation from cancer treatments. So in other words, secondary osteoporosis has nothing really to do with age. So that's another misconception. It's an old person's problem. No, we all need to think about our bone health throughout our entire life. Other things that osteoporosis means that you're going to fracture. It actually doesn't. You can live a very long, healthy life and never experience a single fracture, even with a diagnosis of osteoporosis, which is something that I think it makes it very unique from other conditions or pathologies, because it does mean you need to take action to prevent that, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have that scary outcome. And I think that's a really positive thing. So also, along those lines, people thinking that osteoporosis is just about bone density, and it's not. Bone density it's a good portion of what compromises good bone health, but it's not all of it.
So what else is it?
So there's the quality of the bone that is also important. And this is about the microarchitecture of the bone and the turnover rate at which the metabolic activity is occurring of bone resorption. So we're looking at the structure as well. These are things, you can get blood tests to look at the turnover. And there are tests that can look at quality, but they're not so widely available. So still to this day, the most everybody is going to be getting a bone density test. It's very uncommon in the greater population that people are able to get the quality access. But it's also important to know that, you have bone tissue is made up of cells, right? But also we have ground substance, and we have the density really comes from I guess I would say the crystalline structures. You think about calcium, right? And these other minerals that make up the hard component. But there's also an element of collagen that is greatly important to the structure of bone. And collagen is also very much what gives bone its strength. And that's not the density side. So this part of the conversation gets very much overlooked, partly because we don't really measure that. But it's important to know that that's also what gives it its strength. And also it's in part of the integrity as well. And the resiliency, this ability for bone not to just be brittle. Like we think of brittle bones as weak bones, but also you don't want an imbalance in the structure of bone where it's overly, I don't want to say overly dense, but we're just focusing on the density, and you don't have that other collagenous part, because that's a whole other disease and pathology unto itself.
I'm so glad you've talked about that, because I have heard about that, but I didn't really understand it. And everybody always just talks about bone density, whereas, there are people in my community and within Menoclarity that we're looking at the other side of it, and yet we're not the experts. We don't know, but we sense that there's something else. There's more from what we're reading, and so I'm so glad that you've explained that. And it's so
Well,
important not to just get fixated on the density.
absolutely. And two other things that go alongside with that is, it's very easy to, gosh, there's so many things to go here. One thing is it's very easy to fixate on density, and partly because that's what we can measure, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, there are a number of shortcomings with bone density, just with the testing. And I'm not saying not to do it, but to keep that in mind in the bigger picture. But
Mm.
also that there are more fractures that occur in those with low bone mass of osteopenia than those with osteoporosis, which technically is even lower bone mass than osteopenia.
Wow.
Now, granted, part of that is yes, there are more people with osteopenia than osteoporosis. And
Mm-hmm.
osteopenia, to clarify, is the precursor to
Mm-hmm.
osteoporosis. You have some low bone mass, but not to the extent of osteoporosis. But there are plenty of studies that are showing some of these challenges. In fact, the American Association of Clinical Oncology had pointed out that more than 80% of fragility fractures occur in women with bone density in the osteopenia range. So, this kind of
Wow.
opens our eyes to say, wait, what do we make of all these definitions and conditions? Therefore, so it's to just shed a little bit of light on not focusing solely on density, because obviously it's not the bigger picture. What do you care if your bone density is low, or I should say, what do you care if your bone density has increased if you're still fracturing? So we have to think about the real end game that we're in here, which is about fracture prevention.
And it's like so many things in medicine, it's never just one clear-cut thing, is it? That there's always a context to it, there's other things involved, we need to look
Yes.
at the big picture. Yeah.
Yeah, context, and that's part of our challenge, in this age of
Mm,
social media as well,
mm.
as how do you relay context? How do you relay nuance? We love sound bites, but
Oh,
it's
yes.
everything in life is more complex, and
Yeah.
bone health is most certainly one of them. I mean, the changes that I've seen in the last 20 years in the field is pretty profound.
It's fascinating, and it's always the case that, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
Do
Yes.
we? It's interesting because when I had the early menopause diagnosis, I was told immediately to go onto hormone therapy,
Mhm.
because it would supposedly give me additional protection for my bones and my heart, because I've had less years of estrogen. In fact, my diagnosis, I'm convinced, was wrong. I was in perimenopause. I wasn't through menopause.
Mhm.
But
Can I also
I
ask you what year that was? Because I'm curious in relation to the turn or the timeline of the
so
HRT.
17 years ago,
Okay. Yep.
because I'm now 58. So
Yeah.
17 years ago. And I didn't want to go on hormone therapy. And they did want me to do it. And we had a conversation, and they said, well, let's check out your bone density. And if your bone density is okay, you don't need to go on the HRT. But if it isn't, we'd like you to go on the HRT. So I
Yeah.
had a DEXA scan, and I was found to have borderline osteopenia in my right hip.
Mhm.
So I thought, okay, suck it up, Rachel, and I'll go on the hormone therapy. So I went on the hormone therapy, but the advice then was only for me to go on it until so-called average menopause age of 51.
Mhm.
So that's what I did. And at 50, I put in place all sorts of things that helped me manage my menopause without having to be on hormones. And when I said I want to come off it, they said, well, how about you go and have another bone density scan? So I went and had another one, and there was absolutely no change. And I'd also been running over that time. I'd been really proactive about, looking after my bone health as well as other things. There was no change in the score. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to come off the hormones then. And I've done that. And I haven't had a bone density scan since, so we're talking now, I suppose, 5-6 years since I've had one. I don't know what the situation is now. But it's really interesting to hear you talking about, the fractures with osteopenia, not
Well,
just with osteoporosis. I'm thinking, oh gosh,
a few
wow.
things to unpack, as well as some advice here,
Mm-hmm.
is whether it might be unsolicited, but however, first of all, to know that no change once we're in a post-menopause,
Mm.
no change is good still.
That's what I thought.
So no
That's
change
what I
is
thought.
actually a good thing, because if you think about a natural decline, you're halting the decline. So that's
Mm.
a great thing.
Mm.
Next, that it should be stated here for listeners, wherever they are in the world, the UK's guidelines are different from the US. In the UK, hormone therapy is used to both prevent as well as treat osteoporosis. In the United States, it's only to treat. So, scratch that. It's only to prevent. It is not used to treat. So, in
Mm.
other words, if you have osteoporosis, hormone therapy is not recommended. And this is coming out of just having been at our big the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation's
Mm.
conference, like your Royal Osteoporosis Society.
Yeah.
Um, in the UK, that's the guidelines are different. So I just want to clarify that.
Mm.
The third thing, though, the unsolicited advice is that the challenge with hormone therapy, and I think it can be I think it can be fantastic. The challenge is when it comes to the bone health side of it. Once you stop, your body would basically return to the point as if you had never been on it. So I
Yes.
do strongly recommend you do get a bone density test to check if it actually has declined, because having gone off that, it's possible that that mitigation of bone loss that it was occurring has been removed.
Mm.
So I do recommend getting a bone density test now to see where you are.
Okay. I'll have to pay for that probably then. I'll get that on the National Health.
But this is the thing I tell people is, and obviously there is an element of access that I do recognize. But if it is possible for you, and it depends on, what your financial situation is, if it means, skipping 2 dinners out, this is your health, right? Like putting it in the perspective. I talk about this even, with our coaching program that we do for people with osteoporosis. Like what is the actual cost to you of, keeping yourself fracture free and independent?
Mm.
Because the spiral, downward spiral that can be possible is very disturbing when we
Mm.
look at the statistics of what it can mean for us later in life. Even right now, but especially, what will happen for our future selves, because that loss of independence is pretty severe and pretty intense.
Mm. There was a program a few years back on menopause here, and they looked at various things to help with menopause. And they looked at a group of women who did running, who did yoga, and who did no exercise. And the women who did the running had by far the highest bone density of any group. It was really significant, the difference. So I try and do a lot of, well, I had to stop running because I do think I've got a bit of pre-osteoarthritis in my knee, which is very annoying. Trying to work on it, trying to, sort that out. But
Well, there's certainly benefits to the impact that you get from running.
mm,
But as you've probably been seeing on social media in the last, especially the last 2 years, I would say, the importance of strength training and adding more weight
yes.
into your bones is critical. Not to mention that with all the runners that I've worked with throughout the years, there's often there's some major movement deficits and strength
Oh,
deficits.
yes. Well, movement deficit in terms of balance and gait, and I know that.
Well,
I'm very conscious of that.
Well, also it's such a linear motion, right? And so
Mm,
we need different types of movement patterns. We need to be moving sideways. We need
mm,
some elements of slight, at least bits of rotation. And so we need to move in different unexpected ways. So that's one of the deficits I'm talking about. But also, I have just continuously seen such a weakness in glute strength in runners, right?
oh, really? Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
I have that.
yeah, exactly. And that's okay. It just means it's part of this whole big picture we're talking about. It's all about
Yeah.
cross training, right? You think
Yeah.
about longevity of athletes, right? We just finished the
Mm,
Olympics. All these athletes, and how do they get their bodies to survive so long? Well, if you're a swimmer, you're not only doing swimming, right? If you're a sprinter, you're doing far more than just sprinting. No matter what your sport is,
mm,
for the longevity of your sport, you and for performance to excel in your performance, you have to train in different modalities.
mm, mm,
And we should be doing the same in our lives. It's not just doing one thing, and it's not just about strength training, right? That's
mm,
one element, but there are other things that we need to be doing. And to have a body and joints, we're talking about osteoarthritis too, to have joints last, you need to treat them well. Sometimes
yeah.
there's a hereditary component. We were just talking about how my mom had a hip replacement this summer,
Mm,
and I have osteoarthritis as well in a number of joints. And so sometimes there's something that just is in your genetic predisposition, but there are still things that we can do to change that genetic expression, and how we move our bodies
mm.
will dictate also the longevity that our joints and our bodies have.
So tell us about the Buff Bones program then. Tell us about what that is in terms of how we can look after ourselves and maintain our bone health
Yeah.
long term.
Right. Well, so we've been saying for years that Buff Bones is an exercise method for bone and joint health. It's never just been about bone health, because I don't believe that you can separate the two.
No.
Bone health and joint health are inextricably related in the way that I was talking about before. Because if you're not put it this way, if you're not moving your body properly, and you're not integrating your body in the way that movement is designed for, then you don't have the full distribution of forces through your body in an appropriate manner. So either there's going to be additional unnecessary wear and tear on your joints. They're going to either be more likely to break down, or you might be more likely to get injured, which is going to sideline you. And then you're not able to be getting the loads through your body that is needed for the bone density side, right?
Mhm.
Or it's a matter of not even appropriately getting the forces to transmit through your bones in the way that they demand. So, really, you can't separate the two. And this is something that I've been trying to explain for a long time. And this is what we do within Buff Bones. People think it's all about strength training. Strength training is an important element, but you have to arrive at that point, and we do a whole system. Buff Bones is really a method of movement, and so we go through our methodology to create a very solid foundation, working with body organization right from the start, so that we address various compensations that you may have cultivated throughout the years, because you hurt your knee at one point many years ago, and then you started avoiding certain movements as a result because it didn't feel so good. And then your body just remembers that. So you have these little aberrant patterns that you've never addressed, and then it starts to manifest some point later on. So we try to address that and kind of, as you were saying before, nip it in the bones right from the beginning. Um, but also help you appreciate the way your body moves and cultivate that um, appreciation for it, but also restore confidence, because many people who've been diagnosed with osteoporosis, regardless of whether they've fractured, have lost faith in their bodies.
Mm,
And so to restore your confidence as well as help you embody movement in a new way is very critical to the method. So then we start, and we're working on mobility and strength and balance and coordination throughout the entire time. but addressing also these restrictions in the fascia, the connective tissue of the body, which is another thing that I think makes it very unique, is the emphasis on fascia conditioning as well within the method. And then we're working our way up to strength training that comes in as well. And then how do you get these loads and maximize the loads through your body as well, in a way that more recent research has shown that bone density requires. So we're, I would say, a very comprehensive approach to body conditioning with bone health at the forefront.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I think it's amazing what you're doing. I really do. And I love the fact that it is such a complete system. Yeah. And as you say, you can't separate out the bones from the joints, but it's the whole skeleton, isn't it? It's the whole way that we move.
Yes.
And when you talked about, that we develop these niggles throughout life, and I'm finding, through my 50s, the niggles are coming through, and I'm having to listen, and I'm having to say, okay, why is this happening to me? So my right side is always so much stiffer than my left. I get pain in my left calf when I'm sleeping, and I don't get it in my right. And I'm like, why?
Sure.
Why is this happening? But I think a lot of people, we can dismiss it, or we can go, oh, well, it's a pain, but it's just happening. Whereas actually we need to understand what's going on, and potentially address it if we can work
Yeah.
out what's
And
going
I
on.
think if we approach it from a place of curiosity,
Yes.
it can help alleviate and reframe the conversation of, oh, this is pain or my body breaking down. If we think, oh, I mean, it's easier said than done, and I
Yes.
recognize that. But if we could just be more curious in general, I think so many issues could be alleviated, maybe not resolved, but certainly alleviated. So, okay, why do I have this pain in my, or this discomfort in this side and not the other side? What is it I'm doing? And, more often than not, you do need to work with a movement specialist or an exercise
Yeah.
specialist or a physio who, has some insight into this, because this isn't your specialty. You can't be expected to figure it out by yourself.
Mm.
But when you work with a specialist, it can be a really fascinating and enlightening journey that
Mm.
you can discover, oh, look at what I was doing. And it's not criticism. It's like, oh, look, I'm changing this pattern. And wow, look at the opportunity for change that I have in my
Mm.
body. Talk about
Mm.
agency, talk about feeling empowered and having an ability to change the course of how your body moves and how your body feels. That to me is really profound and exciting.
Mm. And you talked about the importance of lifting weights. How important is that, and what sort of level of weight, and how often? What are we really talking about?
So it is important. And, the research in recent years has pointed to more and more toward high intensity strength training, progressively increasing in load. So you don't just start out there, you start out with almost nothing and you work yourself up to these heavier weights. Newer research is being conducted now to look at a head to head comparison between whether it's moderate versus high intensity. But from what we know right now, the heavier the weights that you can use, the better. But it does require supervision. This is not something you just do on your own.
Mm.
And what kind of weights are we talking about? Well, it really differs. It's completely dependent on the person. And I should also point out that we're talking about without certain comorbidities or injuries, without recent fractures for sure, and that people that have had fractures, it should be on a case by case basis, working with a specialist and determining whether or not that is even appropriate for them, of how heavy they would go. But in the absence of that, in the average healthy individual, let's say, but including those who have a diagnosis of osteoporosis, looking about 80 to 85% of the most you can do, or in your intensity level. So the most that you could do of a single rep of one exercise, you're not going to go to that that level, that intensity, you would back off to about 80 to 85% of that. But again, it takes months to work up to that. That's not something that you're just starting with. So to be really clear, I don't want people getting injured because they're going to suddenly go out to the gym and start, lifting with way heavier than they've ever done before, and they have no conditioning in their body to begin with.
Mm, mm. But ideally, it would be good for us to be aiming towards that.
Yes, that's really what we want to aim towards. And also bringing in some impact. So you're talking about running, really where the research is pointed toward is about 4 times your body weight, for like the ground reaction force that you'd want. So we're talking about jumping. We're talking about jumping off maybe even higher than like jumping off of a box, but that's not where you start, right? Safe place for people to start is just with heel drops. So you're standing around, you keep your knees straight, you lift your heels a little bit, and you just let them fall and drop down. So you get that kind of pounding.
Okay.
And, say start off with 10 of those, work yourself up to 50.
Interesting. So you literally just standing, lift your heels up and then drop them down.
Yep. Yeah, those are called heel
Wow.
drops. Yep.
Wow, I never heard of that one. That's a nice, easy one. You can do that brushing your teeth, can't you?
I wouldn't do it brushing your teeth because you might end up. But
Yes.
I would do
Maybe
it.
not.
I would do it while
Waiting for the kettle to boil.
Exactly. It's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
While you're waiting to make your tea, that's the perfect time to do it.
Wow, that's a nice little movement I'm going to add into my day. I don't have anything like that. I was skipping at one stage, and I stopped that as well because of the knee. I'm going to try and go back to it. I've started just jumping gently, and that's get a bit of force through the bones. Yeah,
Exactly.
wow, this is absolutely fascinating. And I know you travel a lot. Have you seen differences in bone health in other cultures with different diets? Have you seen differences in approach to bone health?
I would say the biggest thing is the awareness. So, in addition to having our coaching program for the average person like yourself, as well as we have on-demand offerings for those who want to just go straight online to learn certain things. We also have instructor training. So we've been training exercise professionals for more than a decade. And so I travel quite a bit running these around the world. And so, yes, I find, I've been in the UK for many, many years, and I find that those in the UK are quite aware. In China, I found they were not very aware of osteoporosis. Like there, for instance, there is a need for public attention to even bring awareness to the condition and how prevalent it is. I would say there's obviously different diets in different countries. Spain, just by nature, I don't find as many vegetables as I do easily accessible as in Italy, right? I think, the Asian diet. So when it's interesting, in Japan, I find that they are much more aware of osteoporosis than actually in China. But both cultures have a high emphasis on vegetables. There's a lot of vegetables in the diet. There's obviously elements of soy, and there is protein as well. It's different, I think, from the way, and actually there's a lot of protein. There's a lot of meat in both cultures, and certainly fish as well. But when it comes to something even like the China study and the identification of people in rural China who were not having these same levels of osteoporosis as those in the more urban areas. And is it more about toiling in the field? Is it more about the diet? Is it about sun exposure and vitamin D?
And the
Well,
lack of dairy traditionally. I remember
lack of
picking up
dairy.
on that. And
Yes. And it's interesting what we can do, certainly in American culture, and I think in Western cultures as well, is extrapolate information that is taken from a study. So I'm kind of switching gears from the study that took place in China, switching gears to that from the discussion of travel. But I think culturally, and this discussion, it's relevant because we tend to extrapolate information from a study and we become very reductive with it and say, oh, well, then this is the one thing I should eat. And now everybody's eating tofurkey here, not so much
but it's
now.
all processed and
For a
pretty
while,
nasty, isn't it?
Food. And again, it's about how it fits into the bigger picture. This is like the theme of our conversation today, right? Nothing can be taken out of context. Like you have to see it in the big picture of whether it's the entire body or the entire diet, and recognize that, there's never one single solution or one single answer to whatever our challenges.
Now, I know I could talk to you all day, but I know we're limited for time. So what would you most like to leave my listeners with today?
I think two things. One is to recognize that bone health is something that we really should put at the forefront of our midlife concerns and attention. Let me nix that word, concerns, but our attention at midlife. And we have a real opportunity to change what our future selves are going to be looking like and feeling like by taking action right now for our bones. And secondly, to think about the wonders essentially of the body, and that the human body is marvelous and fascinating, and to explore the potential that your body has. And exercise doesn't have to look one way. I'm talking about the importance of strength training, but again, that's not where you would really begin. Explore, especially for many people who've been intimidated by it. And we hear from a lot of those people. Start from a place of exploration and find something that you enjoy doing. Because whatever is most effective is actually going to be the movement or exercise that you actually do. So start off there and then be curious to explore more.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.